All right, everybody, we are ready to get started for our keynote for the evening. Woo, cool beans. So I'm very delighted and honored to introduce Dr. Dennis Mckenna. Woo! His professional and personal interests are focused on the interdisciplinary study of ethnopharmacology and plant hallucinogens. He received his doctorate in 1984 from the University of British Columbia, where his doctoral research focused on ethnopharmacal investigations of the botany, chemistry, and pharmacology of ayahuasca and akohe, two orally active tryptamine-based hallucinogens used by indigenous people in the Northwest Amazon. Dr. Mckenna received postdoctoral research fellowships in the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology, National Institute of Mental Health, and in the Department of Neurology, Stanford School of Medicine. He joined Shaman Pharmaceuticals as director of ethnopharmacology in 1990 and relocated to Minnesota in 1993 to join the Aveda Corporation as senior research pharmacognosist. He joined the faculty. Thank you. He joined the faculty of the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota in 2001. He is a founding board member of the Heffter Institute and serves on the advisory board of nonprofit organizations in the field of ethnobotany and botanical medicines. He recently completed a project funded by the Stanley Medical Research Institute to investigate Amazonian ethnomedicines for the treatment of schizophrenia and cognitive deficits. At the Heffter Research Institute, he continues his focus on the therapeutic uses of psychoactive medicines derived from nature and used in indigenous ethnomedical practices. Together with his brother, they had the courage to really bring awareness of these medicines and substances over to America for a serious and fun study. And I think everybody in this room probably owes in some way their interest in psychedelics to this gentleman right here. So please join me in a warm welcoming for Dr. Dennis Mckenna.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for this wonderful, warm welcome. It's great to be here. I want to thank Daniel and Kelsey and all the other people with Medicinal Mindfulness that put this together. This is a great conference. Are you having a good time so far? Good. Well, I know I am. And for me, this is really personally meaningful because some of you know, but some of you may not know that I am a CU alumnus, 1973. And Boulder was 1969 to 1973. I did my undergraduate work here. Boulder was even then a nexus for societal and consciousness transformation. 69 to 73. It was a wild time, I can tell you. and we were in the thick of it, me and my friends at the time. When we weren't rioting in the streets, we were experimenting with psychedelics. So it's very much like the current times. And they arranged this wonderful Airbnb for me to stay in, a very nice house just a couple blocks from here, but each day it's about 2 blocks from the first place I moved in when I got to Boulder in 1969. This was right after the hashish bust that had, anyway, you could read about that in the book. And by the way, the shameless self-promotion moment here, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss is my new book. It's back there. And the great hash bust of 1969 is well documented. How many of you were alive when Woodstock happened? Very few, right? In this group, right? How many of you were at Woodstock? Not so many. Well, guess what? Neither was I. And the reason I wasn't, I know exactly where I was on Woodstock weekend. I was in the county jail in Glenwood Springs, awaiting transfer to the federal holding facility for arraignment for this hash bust that my brother was on the other end of, off in India somewhere, and he disappeared for a couple of years and let the rest of us take the rap. But good for him. And so I have great fondness, great memories for Boulder. This house that I moved into, 1507 Pine, you should go take a look at it. It's right on the corner. It's now this very high-end, I think it's law offices or something. It's a very handsome building. When I moved in there, not so much. It was kind of a hippie flop house. It was the only place in town that was not so scuzzy that my mother wasn't completely shocked, and I persuaded her to let me move in there. And, they were none too happy with me after the hash bust anyway. So, they wanted me to move into a dorm, and I said, no way am I moving into a dorm. It's going to interfere with my drug experimentation. I'm not going to go there. And so they eventually let me do that. And that place, I lived there like the half of my my undergraduate career, and that place became a hyperspatial launching pad for many a tryptamine expedition, I can tell you. So 1507 Pine, check it out. So they've very kindly given me 2 hours. I don't know how I'm going to fill up 2 hours, but maybe we will. I'm going to give this first talk, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then, depending on what people want, I'll either give another short talk, maybe talk about ayahuasca a little bit, or read a passage from my book. Depending, but we'll see where the feeling of the room is at that point, okay? I do want to put a plug in here for the Heffter Research Institute. Was mentioned in the introduction. Heffter is, we founded it in 1993. It's a nonprofit. It's like MAPS, just not as well known as MAPS. Boy, is it not as well known as MAPS. MAPS is very good at publicity. We're not so much, but actually most of the psilocybin work is done under the Heffter umbrella. We are funding most of the groups now, the Johns Hopkins, NYU, UCLA, different groups are working with psilocybin on various aspects. And that's mostly Heffter's work, and Heffter rarely is acknowledged for this. So if you want to give money away to a poor, needy nonprofit that's doing great work, give money to Heffter, because we need that support too. And you can visit heffter.org and see what we're up to. A lot of the investigators in this field are closely affiliated with us. So check it out when you have time, and let's get going. So the human brain, is one of the most complex structures that we know in the known universe, and there's some gee whiz things you can say about that complexity. The adult human brain has about 100 to 500 trillion synapses. Synapses being the gaps between nerve cells across which neurotransmitters are the signal transduction molecules that send a signal from one neuron to another. So the brain has more synaptic connections than all the computers and routers on the internet. which is remarkable. You can compare it to another complex object, which is actually not nearly as complex, the Milky Way galaxy. The Milky Way galaxy only contains about 100 billion stars. If each synapse in our brain is equated to a star, our brains are the equivalent of 1,000 galaxies. So that gives you an idea, of the complexity. The brain has sometimes been called the 3-pound universe. And because within this 3 pounds of spongy tissues, there are not only galaxies, there are multiple universes, because it's the dwelling place of consciousness. How did that come about? That's one of the questions we want to address, or at least speculate. We probably won't come away with any answers. You'll come away with more questions than answers. That's the hope. If that's true, then I'm giving a good talk. But because of this evolutionary anomaly, this hypertrophy, the enormous brain that we have, compared to anything else in nature, we as a species are an anomaly in the order of nature. We are the only species with a complex language, and I mean a complex language that can express deep concepts. We're the only technology utilizing species, an inventive species. It's the combination of this big brain, our imagination, and these restless hands that we have with the opposable thumb. We are builders and muckers abouters. We like to manipulate the world. We like to put our ideas and concepts out into the world in the form of inventions. And we're the only species that are able to store information outside of ourselves and transmit that information non-genetically to future generations through oral traditions and writing and these sorts of inventions. Nothing else in nature does that. And we're the only species for whom symbols, ideas, and abstractions are as real as the physical world. We live immersed in an ocean of ideas, an ocean of symbols and concepts. And this preoccupation with abstract symbols is really the foundation of human culture. And if it weren't for language, we wouldn't be in this place, and we really wouldn't have a human culture in the way that we experience it. Culture that we have created on this foundation of language and information is this edifice that's composed of all the human institutions and inventions, art and science and religion and magic and myth and medicine, technology, folklore, law, etc. All of these set us apart from the rest of biological being in this Gaian biosphere. And it's also clear, we know this now from studies of the brain and neuroanatomy, that, culture is essentially built on language, and language, as we experience it and use it, would not exist if it weren't for our extraordinarily complex brain. Large parts of our brain are devoted to the generation of and the comprehension of language, and it's language that really sets us apart. Well, how did we get to this place? We are this anomalous species, which is not to say that we're superior, but we're definitely anomalous. And as we Homo sapiens, the species Homo sapiens, sapiens, as some of you know, mean wisdom, and often I think it's an oxymoron when applied to us. But how did we get to this point in evolution? Well, we have to look at a number of things. We have to look at the fossil record, which is quite spotty, as these things do. But this is one treatment of the supposed sequence of human evolution, and this is a very dynamically changing picture. This diagram is way out of date in some ways, but it will serve On the far axis, on the right vertical axis, is millions of years. And down here on the lower axis is the size of the brain in terms of cubic centimeters. So what we see when we look at the evolutionary sequence is that essentially starting with the first true human, well, actually with many ancestral progenitors, but Homo habilis is considered the first true hominid, which is why it rates the term homo. And again, this picture is changing even as we speak. But Homo habilis lived 2.8 million years ago, was definitely human, probably walked upright, probably used tools, had a very small brain, maybe 700, 800 cubic centimeters, not so big. But in a very short period of evolutionary time, in only 2 million years, which in evolutionary terms is a blink of an eye, the capacity and complexity of the human brain tripled. The next one along the sequence is Homo erectus, which had a much larger brain, 1,100 centimeters. And Homo erectus is interesting because it appeared, he appeared, she appeared, this genus appeared. If this is 2 million years, Homo erectus has been around for about 1.9 million years, indicated by this vertical line here, and only died out about 100,000 years ago. So Homo erectus, in terms of comparison with these other species, is the most successful hominid species that has shown up on the scene in a long time. It lived, almost 2 million years. By comparison, Homo sapiens, that's us, we've only been around about 100,000 years. Modern and neurologically modern Homo sapiens only been around about 100,000 years. So just in terms of evolutionary success, if we're going to match Homo erectus, we have a long way to go, and it's not looking good, friends. I mean, we're going to live, our species is going to persist for 2 million years. Not unless we change a few things. So that's the picture, kind of. And Homo sapiens has, the largest brain. Homo neanderthal, which was contemporary with Homo sapiens, actually had a bigger brain, but there were much bigger brutes, too. So there's a brain to body size ratio going on. And it also had a very complex brain and a fairly sophisticated culture. So that's the picture that you're looking at, and whether that has resulted in is given us what I like to call the problematic primate. We have this evolutionarily exploded brain in terms of time. It exploded in size over a very short time, and it's, by any measure, it's hypertrophied. Why do we need all that cortical tissue? Well, we need it, we know in part, for language. We know a lot of the brain is devoted to the generation of complex language. And symbolic thinking. This is something that we do. We don't think other animals do this. We're a creative, artistic species. We're an aggressive and warlike species. We're very inventive and creative about that, too, devising ever more efficient ways to kill each other. We're a technological species. We like to invent things and manipulate things in our environment. We have a very profound religious and spiritual side to our nature. We're a very clever species. We have, we're curious and we're clever and we can invent things and create things. We're also not a very wise species. And there's a distinction between cleverness and wisdom. This is part of our historical conundrum, and our historical challenge is to bring those things more into sync with each other, because we are now in a position as a species that we can control forces and energies that potentially could bring about the end of life on Earth. And no entity who is not wise should have any right to have their hands on those things. And so we have to get smart. We have to get wise very quickly, and we have to be wise enough to know that just because we can do something, it doesn't necessarily mean we should do something. And this is a hard lesson because, it's built into us that we like to push the envelope. Okay, so just put that picture in your back pocket for a minute. We're a complex species, we're inventive, we're the most, technologically and culturally advanced species that's appeared. We have this, and we're problematic in many ways. And we got there in a very short time. So let's talk about plants for a minute. What do they have to contribute this? For one thing, plants are great chemists. All plants are photosynthetic, and they have figured out how to make an enormous variety of organic molecules from sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide, very simple precursors. And in the process of doing that, they sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is convenient because we already know the problems with carbon dioxide buildup in the atmosphere. This is, in large measure, it's attributable to the fact that we're cutting down tropical rainforests, and that is one of the factors. And also photosynthesis as a chemical reaction happens to produce oxygen as a byproduct. And that's convenient for us too because we happen to breathe oxygen. And long in the ancient Earth, long before photosynthesis got going in a big way, there was an anaerobic environment. Free oxygen was actually the first toxin released into the atmosphere, and it is a toxin if you're not equipped to deal with it. It's a corrosive gas. And that affected evolution way back when in profound ways, which we're not really going to get into too much here. But all plants are great chemists, and this is why great chemists, great human chemists, have often looked to plants and this chemical diversity that they have as inspiration for medicines and other things that they might create, chemists might create. This is just a little cartoon. I kind of like it. It's like, so why don't plants get fat? Well, they're light eaters, right? They're grown. Anyway, if you look at the little deeper in this system, I don't know if you can see. So you got your precursors up here. You've got sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. And what goes on in photosynthesis is that you've got these light harvesting pigments. You've got chlorophyll and other pigments. Those things grab the energy of sunlight, essentially, and use that energy to ionize water, to split water. That's not an easy thing to do, but plants manage to do it at a low temperature. And, this is not a violent chemical reaction at all. What they do with when they ionize it, they use those proteins, that hydrogen that they capture, and the oxygen goes off into as a byproduct. They use that to reduce carbon dioxide into initially simple sugars. So the first reactions of photosynthesis, the first organic compounds that come from photosynthesis are simple carbohydrates. And then from there, it branches off into all of these different pathways that you can see there. It generates effectively the molecules of life. It generates lipids and amino acids and phosphoinositols, all of these different classes of compounds, aromatic and aliphatic amino acids, sugars, of course, all of these things that life is made of. It's the stuff of life. But it doesn't stop there, because these blue boxes here are more or less what they call primary metabolites. They're things that are pretty much found in everything, and life couldn't get along without them. But then plants are not done because they keep making all these other things that are not universal in all organisms. They're only found in certain plants, certain families. They have a restricted distribution. So they're not essential to life, this we know, but the species that make them, why do they bother? Well, for one thing, because they can, because they're good chemists, they've got lots of energy to use to make stuff. But what do these secondary compounds do for plants? They're so-called secondary compounds, and some examples of these are the terpenoids. Rian was talking about these today, and the terpenoids, it's a pretty complex thing. It's not just a small molecular weight terpenes like the compounds that give flowers their fragrances and the stuff you can extract out of plants to make perfumes and things like that. As you go up in complexity in the concatenation of these 5-carbon units that Rian was referring to, you've got your sesquiterpenes, diterpenes, triterpenes, eventually your pigments, the tetraterpenes, even rubber. Rubber is essentially a large polymer of terpene of these 5-carbon isoprene units. You've got your plant steroids. Don't want to go too far. And every one of these labels represents thousands and thousands of compounds. The chemical diversity that you find in plant metabolites is just staggering. And then over here you've got your phenolic compounds, which are the sources of things like flavonoids and tannins, lignans, the structural material that makes plants woody, the structural material of wood. You've got flavonoids that have all sorts of biological activity and also happen to be highly colored. These are compounds when the colors turn in the fall in a temperate climate, chlorophyll is destroyed by light. If the sap's not running, chlorophyll goes away. It's photo-degraded, leaving the flavonoids, which are red, yellow, all these beautiful colors of the fall. And they have many other functions. And then over here, you've got your nitrogen-containing secondary compounds. Here's where it gets interesting to us. Not that all of this isn't interesting, but this is especially interesting because the nitrogen-containing secondary metabolites include the alkaloids, and many medicines that are important to us are alkaloids. Alkaloids are secondary products that contain nitrogen. Usually they come from amino acids, but not always. But they have biological activity, including often psychoactivity. And so, we have learned to value alkaloids. They're medicinal and valuable to us economically. All the good ones and all the bad ones, Nicotine, cocaine, hyoscyamine, all of these things are alkaloids, but also psilocybin, DMT, caffeine, thank God, all alkaloids and very useful and biologically active. So you have this incredible chemical diversity basically in any photosynthesizing plant and in the ecosystem. As a result, you have, what amounts to this chemical ecology. What do the plants do with these things? They use them as signaling molecules. These secondary metabolites are messenger molecules. Plants don't behave or respond to their environment in the way we do. They respond through biosynthesis. They're virtuoso chemists, not so good at running away from danger because they're stuck in one place, right? So they have to relate to their environment through chemical signaling mechanisms. And that's exactly what they do. They use these secondary metabolites as messenger molecules to mediate their relationships with everything else in the environment. And that would include other plants and fungi and microorganisms that they may interact with either as potential pathogens or as symbiotic partners for doing various things. Insects, the chemically mediated relationships between insects, which are so important in the pollination process of flowering plants, all mediated through plant secondary chemistry. And the insects benefit by getting the nutrients, the nectar, and so on, and the plants benefit because the insects complete their life cycle. Kind of alien for us as mammals. We don't require usually a third species to intervene to complete our reproductive cycles, but plants do. And herbivores, they interact with herbivores, which is another way of saying something that might want to eat a plant. And they send signals to them, and we're in that category. They send signals to us. Sometimes the message is, it's just, the message is defense. The message is, stay away. I make toxins. You don't want to muck with me. More often and more interestingly, the message is, come closer. The signal is, come closer so that we can symbiose together. We can form an alliance that's mutually beneficial. This is what you see in the insect world at a very sophisticated level. So these are, again, broad definitions which don't do justice to a whole variety of functions. But basically, these secondary compounds are for defense or to send a signal, semiosis, and to form symbioses. This is basically what these secondary compounds do. And the compounds that are involved in this may have multiple functions, depending on what they're interacting with and where. Rian, again, was talking about the MAO inhibitors in ayahuasca. Well, that's useful, that's something that they do, but in terms of the ayahuasca plant's interaction with other things in its environment, MAO inhibition is not so important. They're also photoactive, they're antibiotic, they're all sorts of things. So these molecules have multiple functions as messenger molecules. And again, insects are probably. So let's bring these things together. We talked about the evolution of the brain and how fast it was and how complex it is and how we got there. So let's return to that. And then in the context of this plant chemical evolution and the fact that we evolved in this incredible complex chemical ecology, what was the effect of that? What were the consequences? So we're omnivores, right? Pretty much. Primates eat a wide variety of plants. And so we evolved as individuals and as a species and as communities immersed in this chemical ecology in which these secondary products were all over the place. And they come to us through the diet. We're dietary exposure to these secondary products, and that has a number of consequences. It has direct effects on the phenotype, which is the expression of the genotype. And some of those effects include things like recognition or avoidance strategies, repulsion mechanisms to protect us from things that might not be good if we were to consume. And we have also developed very sophisticated behavioral detoxification technologies. We don't think of them as sophisticated, but the idea of cooking something, that's a big deal. For a long time we didn't cook things, and the idea of peeling something or do other kinds of things that might render a plant more palatable and less toxic, we invented these things, and these are ways of adapting and essentially forming that symbiosis with the plants. As well, there are also inbuilt physiological adaptation mechanisms. We have many inducible enzymes, primarily in our liver, and if we're exposed to particular chemicals, those enzymes, which normally sort of exist in potentiality in the genome and they're not expressed, but when you're in a specific chemical ecology, then those enzymes become, the genes are activated, the enzymes are created, and you can then adapt to your unique chemical ecology. This is what makes every single person is a biochemical individual, because every person's ecological, chemical ecology milieu, if you will, is actually unique. And so those processes, and then on the genomic side, it also has direct effects on the genotype. Alterations in DNA and RNA processes, molecular changes in specific gene products. In other words, this enzyme induction that I was talking about and many other things. All of this ultimately results in what I'm calling initiated variations in diverse metabolic processes, which is a long-winded way of saying that this has effects on populations and individuals in terms of their adaptation. Modifications in disease susceptibility, for example, or changes in individual and group biological fitness leading to shifts in gene frequencies in population. This is the raw material of evolution. This is the stuff of evolution, genetic change over time. And you can easily visualize how this might work. Variations in disease susceptibility. I guess a trivial example, if you've got one population living in a valley that happens to have a plant that is a strong immune stimulant, and that population is eating the plant, then they, as a group, would tend to have a higher degree of resistance to infectious diseases than a neighboring population where that plant does not grow. So that the one that has formed the symbiosis with the immune stimulating plant has a leg up. It has a better chance of surviving and thriving, where the other population may be threatened. So these are processes that take place over really millions of years. Okay, so messenger molecules. Well, the brain, plants work, plants, messenger molecules are the language of plants. In a certain sense, neurotransmitters are the language of the brain, and they are also small molecules that mediate this crosstalk between neurons. And all of our critical functions, including our experience of consciousness, is really mediated by this neural communication network. And, and if we think about it, we're biochemical engines. When Salvador Dali was asked, all this crazy surrealist paintings that you imagine, are you taking drugs to get these ideas? And he said, no, I am drugs, as Rian mentioned before. And I think this is a tremendous insight. It's true. We are drugs. We are biochemical engines in a certain way that operate on drugs being the signal transducing molecules that tie everything together into coherent process. You look at a person and you say they look like an object, but they're not. They're actually a process. They're changing, they're metabolizing, and over time they change. If metabolism ceases, then they become an object, and they're not very interesting because they're dead, right? So you need constant change, chemical change that is the process of life. And most psychoactive drugs, we know enough now to know that they function by affecting either the synthesis or the storage, the release, the degradation, or the reuptake of these neurotransmitters, these by and large small molecules, or importantly, these secondary compounds mimic or block the effects at these synaptic receptor sites. And we shouldn't be surprised. All species on Earth arose out of the same ancestral muck in a certain sense. The LUCA, likely the last universal common ancestor is way back there somewhere, but even then its genetic makeup reflected what is found in the modern biosphere. And so these brain neurotransmitters evolved from the same evolutionary precursors, And in plants, they serve probably a signaling function, and our brain has taken them and adapted it to its own sort of internal signaling functions, but they're still plant compounds in a certain ways. For example, the so-called biogenic amine type neurotransmitters, serotonin, norepinephrine, epinephrine, and I guess those are the main ones. They come from amino acids that we are unable to make. We have to get them from our diet. Tryptophan, for example, the precursor of serotonin, is an essential amino acid because we have to get it from the diet. And it's essential because it's one of the 20 that goes into protein. So you've got these plant molecules floating around in your brain, and they happen to be the ones that are on which consciousness runs. So psychedelics are a reflection of this. These are all related to natural products, either from fungi or plants. LSD is semi-synthetic, but it's still a close relative of ergot alkaloids, which occur naturally. And it turns out that the psychedelics have in common that they all interact with a particular subtype of serotonin receptors, known as the 5-HT. Serotonin, another name for serotonin, is 5-hydroxytryptamine. 5-hydroxytryptamine, hence 5-HT. And these common psychedelic receptors are the 2A receptors, one of about 14 different subtypes. And all of the true psychedelics, under that definition, interact with these 5-HT 2A receptors. Now, many other kinds of serotonin receptors around the body. It's not just in the brain. And again, as Rian pointed out, there's far more serotonin in the gut than there is in the brain, and that comes from the microbiome and other sources. But in the brain, serotonin, apparently has this function of mediating some aspects of consciousness. So here we have the problematic primates with these 5-HT2A receptors and many things in the environment that are happy to occupy those receptors and send us a message. They're messenger molecules. What's the message they're sending to the human species? Well, they're sending a number of messages, but the main one, symbiosis, baby. They want to form alliances, relationships with the problematic primates, because the problematic primates are able to form relationships with these plants and fungi, and in some ways protect them from the vicissitudes of natural selection, right? And it's no longer they have to compete in the environment, they just have to cope with the whims of the problematic primates, which can also be a challenge. But they voluntarily, in a certain sense, they form these alliances, we take them under our wing in a way, and we make sure that they don't go extinct. Or maybe they take us under our wing and they're trying to keep us from going extinct, but that's further on. But these relationships, these symbiotic relationships, not just with psychoactive plants, but with any plant that we value, as food, as medicine, as for whatever we get out of it, usually as a result of some chemical property that it has. And it's a good deal, for the plants and for us, at least until we manage to completely toxify, the ecosystem. And if we, maybe we won't do that if we get wise, but that's kind of the challenge. But these psychedelic messenger molecules specifically, they have other important things that we need to assimilate and think about. They, for example, wake up, you monkeys. You're wrecking this place, and in the contemporary society, that is often a frequent realization. People come away with this psychedelic insight that, yes, we are really impacting the world, and we need to become conscious of that and if possible, try to do something about that. Another important message, you monkeys only think you're running the show. And this is true. This is a delusion that we need to get over, and we need to get over it fast. We're not running the show. Actually, the plants are running the show, because they're sustaining life on Earth. So I'd say that's a pretty important function. And I'm happy to let the plants run the show. I mean, we're not doing a good job of it. We're not running it, but we're trying and we're botching it. Another important thing they remind us of, the psychedelic experience, it's an invitation to humility in a certain way, because it reminds us, never forget how little you monkeys know. We can be arrogant as a species. We can say our science is fantastic and we know so much and we've got it figured out. No, we have very little figured out about how the world really is, how the universe is put together. We think we do, but science is very limited in some ways. Science only understands a small fraction of reality, and it understands it imperfectly. And that's just the nature of the beast, and that's a good thing, because science is properly pursued. It's a self-correcting discipline. It's often not pursued that way, being big science and all that, but ideally, science is a really powerful way to ask questions of nature and get answers back that are meaningful. But there's no reason for arrogance, because we always have to remember how little we know compared to what the little bit of knowledge we have compared to how much remains unknown. That, to me, is not depressing. It's exciting, because there's so much left to know. And another message that we should also remember, never forget that you're monkeys. There's nothing superior about our species. We're part of the biosphere. There is nothing inherently to support the idea that we're at the pinnacle of evolution or anything like that. And we should remember that. We're all still in this process of evolving. We're involved in this chemically regulated and mediated global ecosystem. Okay, well, I like to show this sometimes. In this talk, I like to show this, and I can't really see you out there, but how many people recognize what this is? Yeah, the old people, right? Not everybody. You younger generation, this is, of course, the monolith from Stanley Kubrick's movie, 2001. And if you haven't seen 2001, possibly the greatest science fiction movie ever made, thank you. Your homework is to go watch this movie, because it carries a profound message. And the monolith in the movie was literally a deus ex machina, a god from the machine, something that thrust itself into primate evolution. Not clear when it was supposed to be, but maybe a couple million years ago, all of a sudden this thing shows up on the Serengeti plain, and it's like, the monkeys are doing what monkeys do. They're screwing and fighting and taking lice off each other and this sort of stuff. They wake up one morning and all this thing is here. And whoa, they've never seen anything like it. And it stands in for the concept of a mysterium tremendum. It is a absolutely shocking, incomprehensible, utterly alien, totally terrifying event or anomaly, and completely beyond understanding. And they can't look directly at it, and they can't look away either. It's like DMT may be for the first time for people who take it, and maybe it stands in for something like that. But it happens, and the thing is, in the movie, it's something that appears at critical junctures in evolution. First, it shows up on the Serengeti Plain, and then the next time it's encountered is like 2 million years later when we have colonies on the moon and they discover this thing is buried somewhere on the moon, and that moves the plot forward. But the idea is that it appears at critical junctures in human evolution to nudge us along towards some end, toward the end of whatever the evolutionary outcome is to be. So it's a useful concept. It's the mysterium tremendum, the basis of all mystical experiences, the basis of religion itself. But you know, you don't have to go to Jupiter to find this thing, because it's always existed in nature, very quietly, not attracting too much attention until some hungry primate stumbles across it and says, well, that looks like that might be pretty good to eat. And they bend down, pick it up, and chomp it down. And the beautiful thing about psilocybin mushrooms, no technology is required. All that's required is curiosity, enough curiosity to bend down and eat it, and the connection is made. And once that connection is made, then the reality of a transcendent world full of mystery, full of intelligences and wisdom and God knows what is established, the mysterium tremendum. And we, as a society, as a species, are able to connect with this mysterious world, and that is a tremendous boost to our cognitive evolution, if you want to put it that way. And once that discovery is made, we know enough from iconography. The record is spotty again, but we know that once this discovery was made, soon enough, all these other things in different parts of the world were discovered. You know, the mushrooms were probably in Algeria, in the Tsali Plateau, 8,000 BC. The mushroom stones from Guatemala, it says 3,000, but the actual limit is more like 6,000 to 7,000 BC. The mushroom icons in the Selva Pascuala cave, the Chavin, San Pedro icons, and the snuff trays and snuffing tubes from the coastal civilizations of Peru, probably the oldest civilizations and the most ancient evidence of psychedelic use. It's hard to nail down the exact dates because there's no record. These things don't last, right? I mean, especially in an Amazonian environment or a tropical environment. But these snuff trays are indicative because they do last. They couldn't have been used for much else. They were used to snort some powder and presumably Anadenanthera peregrina or colubrina. And the use of these snuffs goes back 11,000 years. So they're easily the oldest psychedelic that we know of that was used. And, so they were around, they were discovered, and they were the basis of, the spiritual worldview of these early civilizations. And this persists in indigenous cultures now. Indigenous cultures regard these things correctly, I think, as plant teachers. They are teachers. They have intelligence, and they teach humankind many things, hopefully wisdom. But they teach us many things. This is a painting by Pablo Amaringo, the visionary ayahuasca painter. These are some of the plant teachers that you find in the Amazonian pharmacopoeia around ayahuasca. It's not just ayahuasca. There are many plants, but this is just an idea of illustration of the plant teachers. And something that comes out of this then, because they work on this, these 5-HT2A receptors, we know from our own experience, and we now know from scientific studies, that psychedelics can reliably induce mystical experiences. Well, what do we mean by mystical experiences? Well, they have characteristics. They have a direct experience of a transcendent other, the idea of a transcendent world that is as real as this one. this mysterium tremendum concept. Incomprehensible, terrifying, fascinating, and literally awe-inspiring, which is kind of a feature of the mystical experience. Another feature is oceanic boundlessness, the idea that we are all one. This is very, and not only one with each other, but one with the universe at large. This is a feature of mystical experiences. And an apprehension that all of existence is united. And usually, well, I mean, how could it not be? These experiences are profoundly meaningful to individuals that have them, to the cultures that revere them. They're profoundly meaningful. And there's plenty of archaeological evidence that in the Mediterranean region, going back to the Paleolithic and even beyond, there were essentially these psychedelic mystery religions that were goddess-based, ecstasy-based, and involved the use of these psychoactive plants and fungi. The one that persisted most into history was, of course, the mystery cult at Eleusis, which was in its heyday from about 500 BC to about 400 AD. And this was the Greek tradition. Everyone who was anybody in Greek society, and you didn't have to be an aristocrat necessarily, but everyone who was participating in the spiritual life of Greece at the time had to make a pilgrimage to Eleusis, the temple of Demeter. And on that pilgrimage, they were given a potion. They were given something that was served to them in a bowl in a dark chamber, and they were not allowed to speak about it. Ideally, some of them did. There were always, like any situation, there were always leakers, right? But they were forbidden to speak about it, and it was supposed to be a profoundly transformative experience, which it was. And it was probably the consumption of either ergotized barley, this has been speculated, or some kind of mushroom, or maybe both. In this bas relief here, it shows Demeter giving Persephone, her daughter. This is the whole myth about Persephone had to go into Hades for half the year. This is why we have winter and so on. Says Persephone, or Demeter is giving Persephone a flower. I have a hard time getting a flower out of this. This doesn't look like a flower to me. Looks like a mushroom. I mean, it's pretty clear. This is kind of an example of the ability of archaeologists to delude themselves. I mean, it seems like this is a mushroom, by any. So anyway, this was probably the last of these psychedelic mystery religions, and they were brutally suppressed and stamped out by the new state-sponsored, state-sanctioned religion around 490 AD or so, which was Christianity. Get to that in a minute, but one of the characteristics of psychedelic experiences and mystical experiences, certain realizations, certain understandings about the way things are, if you'd like to put it that way. For example, biophilia, the notion that, an innate love for living things, an affection for living things is biophilia. And it's all inbuilt into our hearts and souls and minds, who can look at a litter of puppies, for example, and not go, "Aw," and it's just a human reaction. And so we have this inbuilt, positive response to living things. Another perception here is in indigenous culture and psychedelic experiences is animism. This idea that, all non-human entities, even weather, even rocks, anything, it doesn't have to be living, has in some sense a spiritual nature, an inherent spiritual essence. And the other thing that complements that is pantheism, the belief that essentially the universe or the totality of nature is identical with the divine. There is no creator outside the universe that made it. The universe made itself. God itself, the universe is God, if you want to use that loaded word. It's not separate from nature. It is nature in the process of organizing itself into the way we find it. So these are perceptions that characterize very much the psychedelic or the indigenous worldview. Mystical experiences, direct experience of a divine or transcendent reality. Biophilia, love of living things. Animism, all things, living and non-living, have a spiritual nature. Pantheism, God is not separate from nature. Nature itself is divine. There is no intelligent designer. Nature itself is the intelligent design. Intelligence is built into the structure of nature. And these are not these are not belief systems. These are actually empirical observations of the nature of reality that indigenous people experience. And oddly enough, they're similar to currently emerging scientific paradigms. The current scientific understanding of sort of how things are put together is very close to this idea. And so in order to deal with these experiences, cultures had to invent techniques to handle these mysterium tremendum, highly overwhelming type experiences. We had to invent religion, for one thing. Religion is a set of beliefs and practices often centered upon specific supernatural and moral claims about reality, the cosmos, and human nature, and often codified as prayer, ritual, and religious law. Religion also encompasses ancestral or cultural traditions, writings, history, and mythology, as well as personal faith and mystical experience. The term religion refers to both the personal practices related to communal faith and to group rituals and communication stemming from shared conviction. And psychedelics are not in themselves a religion, but what they do is they activate religious sensibilities. And it's interesting to think about that for a minute. So these 5-HT2A receptors that mediate the psychedelic experience are built into our neural architecture, a reflection of millions of years of evolution, and they are able to mediate and, they are the mediators of this mystical experience. What is going on? What is the evolutionary purpose of being able to have a mystical experience? I have no idea. But another thing that we had to invent or devise or create, actually before religion, was shamanism, which Mircea Eliade has aptly called the archaic techniques of ecstasy. Shamanism is technology, essentially. Shamanism is a range of traditional beliefs and practices concerned with communication with the spirit world. Shamanism is a practical technology for navigating in non-ordinary realities, interacting with non-human intelligences encountered there and obtaining knowledge useful to individuals and the community, such as the treatment of illness, the uses of medicinal plants, the location of game, propitious times to plant and harvest, and so on. The induction of altered states of consciousness is usually facilitated by the use of psychoactive plants or fungi, not always, but in most shamanic traditions. In the cultural evolution of humanity, shamanism is older than religion itself, but in many ways not different from it. You have to look to shamanism to understand the roots not only of religion, but also of medicine, pharmacology, chemistry, theater, art, and poetry. All of that springs from shamanism. The shaman in the cultural role is as much poet as healer, someone who through language, song, stories, expresses the cosmic and mythical narratives of their culture as received in the shamanic trance from this totally real, transcendent, but unseen world. I love this passage from an essay in a book called The Mushrooms of Language. It appeared in a compilation of papers, Hallucinogens and Shamanism in 1973, but I think this well expresses it. Language is an ecstatic activity of signification. Intoxicated by the mushrooms, the fluency, the ease, the aptness of expression one becomes capable of are such that one is astounded by the words that issue forth from the content of the intention of articulation with the matter of experience. The spontaneity the mushrooms liberate is not only perceptual, but linguistic. For the shaman, it is as if existence were uttering itself through him, or her, in this case, Maria Sabina. Well, and then historically, about the end of the Eleusinian mysteries and the, around 490 BC or AD, things changed. We saw the rise of the so-called Abrahamic religions. Christianity emerged around the 1st century AD, and by 380 AD, it was the official state religion of the Roman Empire. The Goths invaded and sacked the Temple of Demeter in 396 AD, and that was the end of the last ecstasy-based psychedelic mystery religion. And this effectively changed everything in a certain sense. In common with the other Abrahamic religions, Christianity had a very different perspective on spirituality and salvation than these pagan mystery religions. In the Abrahamic view, God and nature are separate. They are not one, they are different. God is a judgmental, paternal, fully external nature, and man are subordinate to this God. Salvation and revelation are external to nature. Humans are not part of nature. Nature is subordinate to humanity, but we are above or outside of nature in this worldview. Humanity is specifically instructed to rule over and to subdue the earth. So that was the perspective. And with the rise and dominance of these Abrahamic religions, pantheism gave way to monotheism, one God outside of nature. Animism gave way to a devaluation of nature. Only man has a spiritual nature. Mystical experience gave way to doctrines, dogma. Only the priests can talk to God. Direct experience of the divine is forbidden. And biophilia, an inherent and innate love of life, was turned on its head to something that looks a lot like necrophilia. I'm sorry, but there it is. Christianity is focused on suffering and sin and death. And it's kind of a not the real optimistic worldview. We are told by Christianity that we're inherently flawed beings. We are born into sin. We have to be saved by some external savior, some Messiah. We're not perfect. And along comes that Messiah, Christ, and Christ dies for our sins. I'm not sure how that saves us, and that our salvation will be found in heaven. So we're instructed to not value this life. In fact, don't even enjoy this life, because that's forbidden. We're here to learn a lesson, and then we move on to, the afterlife where we get our reward. This sounds like being a skeptic, I have to wonder. We're told we have to reject the temporal world as inherently evil. we live only to suffer and to die. How life-affirming that is. And so 2,000 years on, we're witnessing the consequences of this attitude. Christianity and the other Abrahamic religions give us leave to not value nature, not value ourselves as incarnate beings. So what it's led to is we're raping the earth. We're busy doing that. And, we're very good at that. And we're poisoning the earth, and we're exploiting it. And we're actually even criminalizing nature. We're criminalizing nature. I mean, DMT is a Schedule I controlled substance. It's found in thousands and thousands and thousands of plants, and of course in our own brains. So after this lecture, you have to go down to the police station and turn yourself in for possession of a Controlled I substance. Anyway, and we're destroying the earth, basically, and we're doing it rapidly, and we're getting good at it, and we're now facing the environmental, ecological, and cultural crisis that we're facing. And this is no way to treat our mother. The earth is our mother. This is what we're doing to our mother. This isn't good. So people that think about long time periods in evolution, they come up with various terms, and we're now in what they call the Anthropocene era. This is the era of human impact on the planet. The Anthropocene is the current geological period wherein human activities have a powerful effect on the global environment. And all you have to do is look around to see that this is happening. And what we need to do is get past this. We need to get to the Psychozoic era. The next one, the era that pertains to the period of geological time characterized by the presence of human intelligence. I don't think we're there yet. There isn't a term for the geological era characterized by the dominance of human stupidity. But if there was, that would be the age that we're in right now, and in often willful stupidity, which is dismaying. So we need to make this transition. We have to change human consciousness, collective consciousness on a global scale, so we can make this leap into the Psychozoic era so that we can step up and actually take our true role in becoming a partner with Gaia, a partner with Mother Earth, and not a dominator, exploiter, abuser, destroyer of Mother Earth, because it won't go well if we don't do this. So we have to repair the damage as much as we can of this Anthropocene effects and make it into this Psychozoic era. We basically have two tasks. We have to wake up to this initially, and then we have to wise up. Once we have woken up, then we have to implement our insights. We have to make the changes, which won't be easy, to transform the planet. There is no reason why we should be depleting and destroying the planet. We have ways to prevent this. And actually, it may be our destiny to leave the planet, but there's no reason why we should leave behind a toxic waste dump, when we could leave behind a park, a garden, or whatever. That's a much more appealing scenario. So, I think collectively we have a perception, in the 2000s and ever certainly as December 21st, 2012 approached and then receded in the rear-view mirror of history, but there was great anticipation and almost obsession in our species about the end of history and possible apocalypse, and all sorts of catastrophic scenarios were envisioned, in part influenced by this Christian in Judeo-Christian mindset, because actually on the earthly level, that's the best they can offer, is a global catastrophe. We call it the apocalypse. So we have this preoccupation with the end of the way things are and the intuition that we're transiting into some kind of post-historical era, when history as we know it really will end. And as a species and as individuals, we're the only species in nature that can think about death. We can think about our own death, we can anticipate and embrace it or fear it, but we have the ability to project our imaginations into time. And we can think about the death of the planet. We can think about the death of our species. And in fact, much of the global anxiety that we experience as a culture is a result of this pretty dark and dystopian view. And there's a lot of fear. And we don't know what's going to happen. But we're still within our power to change it. And, if mushrooms were a catalyst for becoming awake way back when, 200,000 years ago or whatever, and made us the problematic primates that we are, maybe mushrooms can pull us out of this funk that we're in, this dystopian worldview, and show us that there is a different future. There's another way we can go if we choose to, And the choice is ours. The one on the left or the one on the right, it's up to us. Thank you.